and you're a Pulitzer-prize winning author. But in my short time doing podcasts, it's the first time I'm talking to someone who has written a cookbook. Hello, my name is Derek Mitchell, and I'm the president of the National Democratic Institute. In this STEMWorks episode, we are joined by Pulitzer-prize winning journalist, analyst, professor, and historian Anne Applebaum. Anne, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Anne Applebaum is one of our most treasured commentators and writers about global affairs, with a particular focus on European politics. Anne has focused much of her career on the dynamics not only of democracy, but of authoritarianism, having chronicled the tyranny of the Soviet Union in books like Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956, and Gulag, A History, for which she won a Pulitzer Prize. She is currently working on another book, this one based on her fantastic cover piece analyzing the political situation in Europe for The Atlantic's somewhat melodramatic Is Democracy Dying edition last October. We are sitting down just days after Poland held legislative elections and just weeks ahead of the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is in that context, facing the current challenges to democracy while assessing its continued resilience, that we sit down today. Let me ask first, the elections in Poland. I know it's too soon, probably, when we're sitting here right now. Your husband is an MP, a European Parliament MP, and former foreign minister.
He wasn't running in the elections, but
right,
but he's a member of the European Parliament from Poland.
And so he's a politician, Polish politician. You live much of the year in Poland.
That's right.
From a distance now, but also from your firsthand knowledge of what is happening now in Poland, what did the elections tell us?
Well, it's funny how expectations shape your perception of events. And many people, including me, expected a real wipeout in these elections. We expected the nativist government, the ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, we expected them to have a huge majority. We expected them to really take over the country. And although they won, that didn't happen. In fact, they got about 43% of the vote, which is big in a multi-party system, but it doesn't give them a majority. And as it turned out, they lost the Senate. There are two houses in Poland. The Senate it's more like a House of Lords Senate than a U.S. Senate. It's not that powerful, but still it was quite a symbolic loss. Right. And that suddenly makes it seem like their assault on Poland's democracy that's taken place over the last 4 years might not have been as successful as we thought it had been.
Right. And that seems to be a theme, though. Over the weekend, there are local elections in Hungary as well, or at least municipal elections where Orban did pretty poorly in the cities. And we're seeing this trend in Turkey.
This is very, very similar in Poland in that the democratic opposition does very well in the cities. But trouncingly, they get 70%, 80%. In local elections last year, I think out of 106 mayoral races in that sort of big cities and small cities in Poland, opposition, non-ruling party candidates won 100 of them. So it's a real difference. There's a real gap between the cities and the countryside in Poland. Although that wasn't the only. There is evidence of some opposition parties doing well in small towns as well. Yeah,
I think that was the same in Hungary as well. So as you analyze what's going on in Eastern Europe and as you observe democracy and the sort of the way democracy evolves, ebbs and flows, do you see then a pattern here that is encouraging for a pushback against the sort of illiberalism that we were so worried about?
So the lessons that we're beginning to gather is that, the reasons why anti-democratic parties, and by the way, the word populist is one I'm very careful and cautious of using because it seems to mean all things to all people. And I have no objection to political parties that win by trying to appeal to a popular mood or so on. My objection is to parties that want, which take over and then immediately begin to assault the institutions of democracy, which has happened in Hungary and has happened in Poland. Right. The ruling party tried to undermine the judicial system. It tried to replace the judges with illegally. with its own judges. It's just really destroyed state media and made it into a kind of propaganda tube of the ruling party in a way that's hard to describe if you don't speak Polish. But I mean, everything from faked broadcasts to made-up stories, and it's almost like a conspiracy site rather than a state broadcaster. And so my objection is to that rather than to their language. And it seems like, one of the things that these kinds of parties learned how to do before others was to make use of new forms of media and new ways of communicating. And they understood better than everybody else that fake stories move faster on the internet than real stories. They understood how to use rumor and innuendo to undermine people, and how to kind of use smear. And it's really only now that some politicians, and by the way, I think it's really more of a coincidence that this happens in Eastern Europe rather than anywhere else. And I mean, you can see the same kinds of parties in Italy. You can see them in Austria. And goodness knows you can see them in I think the Republican Party is not that different in the United States. So, but we're beginning to see now people beginning to work out what are the tactics to use against that. And these include both alternative kinds of communication that seek to unite people rather than divide them. It's to do with investing in quality journalism. It's to do with finding messages that can reach people who feel excluded by the political system. There are different tactics being used in different places. Actually, they didn't have an election this weekend, but there was a very interesting election a few months ago in Slovakia,
right,
where and I've just met the new Slovak president, Zuzana Čaputová, where the president is now a woman who comes from a small town. She was an environmental lawyer. And she was completely outside of politics, or very much on the fringe, from a very small party called Progressive Slovakia. And she won the presidency by, again, appealing over the heads of the divide, by trying to address the whole nation, and by using green and environmental issues, not in a partisan way, but in a way saying, this is our country, we need to take care of it. This is, and she won. There was an echo of that actually in an Austrian presidential election a couple of years ago, where there was a final round between a green candidate, who's now the president of Austria, and a far-right candidate. And again, his message was all about our beautiful country. We all love it. Pictures of the Alps. And so, I'm being a little facetious, but not entirely. That there may be a way to appeal to people's sense of pride and identity without using negative language and hateful slogans and fear and so on.
Yeah, true patriotism, love of country, but an alternative vision.
Patriotism instead of nationalism.
Right. In a sense that, there is an alternative vision to what these folks were offering. Maybe in the past it was too technocratic, that the elites were just thinking because we say all the time, democracy needs to deliver. The irony is, in Poland and Hungary, it delivered economically.
Very much so.
But there was still something missing in terms of vision and identity, or something at least the opposition at the time can play on in order to get electoral advantage.
Maybe there was first of all, I dislike this idea that the elite did this or that, because there's a ruling party elite in Poland now. There's a law and justice elite, and always was, by the way. So
but the attitude of that somehow they were representing the forgotten, the people that are being left behind.
This was the language that they successfully used.
Right.
Whereas, as I say, this election that we've just had shows that they represent a lot of people, but they don't represent everybody, and they don't even represent the majority.
Yeah.
And so to describe themselves as representing the real Poland when they don't have a majority in the country is, it's a bit much.
Right. But I guess that's the strategy, though, is even if they don't represent that, they play to the fear or the insecurity, whether it's an identity insecurity or an economic insecurity in this case.
That's the strategy, and that's what they use to. That's what they say gives them the right to change the Constitution, to undermine the judiciary system, and so on. This is the argument that they use.
Yeah.
In Poland, the thing I think that's hard for outsiders to understand is that they use very what we would call in the West right-wing language. They talk about patriotism and Christianity, and much of their campaign was anti-gay rights.
Yeah,
and it
moral
was
values, family.
but being very
in their
specifically
view.
anti-gay,
Yes.
anti-homosexual in a
Yeah.
very sharp and very ugly
Right.
way. At the same time, their economics have been what we would call left-wing. And so
Right.
they've done a major redistribution of wealth at the expense of, I might say, hospitals, schools, investments in infrastructure, and even business itself. But nevertheless, they've done a big, almost sort of Latin American style, classic form of populism. And so I hate the expression. I don't mean to say that they're Nazis, but the expression National Socialism is really apt here, and it's hard to find the language to push back against that. I mean, I think particularly in a moment when, as you say, we've actually had 2 decades of economic success in Poland. The last several years have been particularly good in Europe. There's been an economic boom, partly thanks to U.S. monetary policy, and that's been what the change may come when that begins to turn.
For more than 35 years, NDI has been honored to work with thousands of courageous and committed small d Democrats around the world to help countries develop the institutions, practices, and skills necessary for democracy's success. During that time, we have conducted programs in more than 150 countries, and today operate in over 70 countries and maintain more than 50 offices globally. To learn more about NDI or to sign up for our monthly newsletter, please find ndi.org on your web. Did we get something wrong when those of us who promoted or interested in democracy? I mean, this issue of identity is so critical everywhere you go that these countries were liberated from the Soviet yoke, I guess in some way they felt like they were asserting nationalism at those days. But there's a questioning of whether they want to be Western or what is going on in terms of identity inside these countries.
So
that we
there
can
is
learn from?
they have these so-called populist parties, these far-right parties, have successfully appealed to people who have felt in the last decade, if not economic fear, then some kind of, as you say, fear about their identity. One very brilliant analysis was made by my friend Ivan Krastev, who's a very brilliant Bulgarian intellectual, who has pointed out that the really striking change in many of these countries since 1989 is not the phenomenon of immigration, which is the thing everybody talks about, but the phenomenon of emigration. Thousands of young people leaving to go and work abroad. And the sense that this has given a lot of people that, our country is going to be erased, we're disappearing, we're being absorbed into Europe or into the world. The global economy will wipe us out. As Ivan put it in one of his books, he said, in 100 years, will there be anybody to read Bulgarian poetry? Maybe not. And the spectacle in 2016 of a big wave of immigrants arriving into Europe from the Middle East somehow did trigger this, a deepening of that fear, because it didn't make people feel, saying that, we need immigrants because we don't have enough people to do the jobs, didn't make people feel better who are worried about losing some sense of nationhood. And so I think the parties and politicians that will do well in the region will find either will find some answer to that, or will begin to play on increasing. There are some issues that also play into people's sense of what it means to be European. One of the interesting phenomena in Poland and Hungary, but also in France and especially Germany, is the rise of green parties, which also appeal to some kind of sense of being part of a larger community and owing something to your neighbor and so on. So there's almost a competition right now between these national issues and these international issues, which are both inspiring to different kinds of people.
And Krastev, I think, was just quoted by Roger Cohen from a conference in Athens where he said people in Hungary are more likely to see a UFO than a refugee. And yet they might vote based on concern of
Yes.
refugees or migrants.
Yes,
or
in Hungary, Orban very successfully used this threat that refugees are coming and they're going to drown out Hungarian culture,
Yeah.
which had some impact in a country where, particularly Hungary, where it's a very small country. They have a very unique language. Nobody else seems able to learn it. They have this feeling of being all by themselves, as one Hungarian friend, alone in this sea of Slavs and
Yeah.
people who speak German. So it has a particular resonance. I mean, actually, in Poland, the refugee issue never really didn't go on working, which is why the government turned on the gay issue as a. I can't underline enough how ugly this campaign was
Yes.
with,
Yeah.
with a documentary about the gay invasion. And very targeted language, but it's somehow meant to make people afraid that they're going to lose some sense of Polishness or their Polish family or something. But I would point out it didn't work. I mean,
Yeah.
it didn't succeed, at least not across the whole country. And you also there may be a certain percentage of people who just ignored that and said, well, we're so happy about this welfare distribution and the growth of the welfare state that we don't mind.
Right. And it was assisted by the church to some degree. I mean, or was there division?
Unfortunately, there is a part of the Polish Catholic Church which has abandoned its former neutrality. So it was for decades and really centuries, the Polish Catholic Church was a kind of symbol of the nation, and even people who weren't particularly religious felt they owed it something, and it had a special role all through the communist era as an institution that was some kind of refuge from, so literally churches were refuge, but also kind of morally it was a refuge. John Paul II was Poland's great pope, who was, who spoke a sort of different language from the communists and reminded people about history and so on. Unfortunately, the church has now lost that status, and it is seen as very partisan, and it has supported this, the current ruling party.
Right.
And I'm afraid that what you may have in Poland in a few years down the line is a scenario, as in Ireland, where people really turn away from the church. A lot of people are very angry. Young people are angry at that, and it's sad, really.
And is there a demographic divide, an age difference?
There is a
Young
demographic divide.
Yeah.
There are fewer and fewer people going to church every year.
Yeah.
But of course, this is another one of those issues that creates fear among people who fear that something is being lost. And in a sense, they're right. They are losing something.
Yeah. Well, let me draw back a little bit. I mentioned early on we're just weeks away from the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we're all focused. Much of the rhetoric is about how democracy has regressed in the last 15 years, and there's a crisis in democracy. As the Atlantic edition was, "Is Democracy Dying?" Was, as I say, one of the more melodramatic headlines. But you can say, even with the regression of the past 15 years, over 30 years, the sweep has been pretty substantial towards more democratic expectation among societies. There's still democratic practice, even if there's illiberalism and cutting down of institutions in places like Poland and Hungary and Czech and such. But there is at least more of an expectation that democracy is and democratic processes should abide. Are you more or less optimistic about the moment we're in? Is it a matter of mismatched expectations, or do you feel there is we truly are in a crisis moment for democracy?
So it's funny, I wrote so much about the anniversary of the fall of the wall and the end of communism at the 25th anniversary that I feel a little burned out on the 30th anniversary, and I've been asked to write some things, and I've been somehow staying away from it. I think it is still true that when you look at the past 3 decades, and you look at what kinds of expectations we had in 1990, you can't say anything except that the last 3 decades have been an overwhelming success. Both an economic success, a political success, a success in terms of integrating Europe. I think the fact that the problems in Poland aren't really that different, frankly, from the problems in Italy. And the problems in Austria have a relationship to Hungary. It is a testimony to the fact that the region is actually pretty well integrated, and some of this, we see now kind of similar politics, similar tactics, moving back and forth, between what we used to call Western Europe and what we used to call Eastern Europe, pretty well. And as I said, and then as we've already discussed, the economic growth, particularly in Poland, but also in the rest of the region, is stunning. This was the poorest region in the world, or one of the poorest region in Europe. And now Poland is ahead of Portugal, in per capita income and catching up with others. So I think you have to look at it in the long term as a success. I mean, I think the bigger question is not so much about that region and about Europe. I mean, the bigger question is really for all of Western democracies. How are we going to cope with the rapid and revolutionary change in information technology and in other kinds of technology that have really unsettled the way in which people get and process political information, have undermined traditional political parties, have undermined establishment news organs, and I think in a way that they aren't. And I don't think they're going to recover. I mean, one or two will recover, and it will be the same. But the world that we knew it, in which we somehow expected that there was going to be some kind of free competition between newspapers and TV, and somehow the best news would win, and the most accurate information would be what everybody eventually came to accept as true. I think that's not true anymore. And the question is whether any of our democracies, from the United States to the Philippines, to Bulgaria, can survive in a world where we no longer have a single national conversation, where people inhabit different echo chambers, where there is no consensus about facts, where policy can be made on the basis of conspiracy theory or rather than on the basis of rational debate. And that is a question for all of us. And that seems to me 30 years after 1989. That's the question that that again none of us would have predicted at that time would be facing us.
It's funny. I've read. I'm trying to think of his name. He did the Clash of Civilizations.
Samuel Huntington.
Huntington. He wrote not in the Clash of Civilizations, but another piece about the third wave of democratization. Yes. And I reread that before I started NDI about a year ago. And he actually predicted this moment in a way. He said, watch what happens in places like Poland and Hungary. Watch about what happens in Russia. He also talked about new technologies can create a challenge to democratization, democracy.
Journalists in general are under fire. I think investigative journalists probably are in far greater danger than cartoonists in many ways. But there is something about political cartoons that gets under people's skin faster, quicker, and in a more irritating fashion than the written word. And I think that's sort of true around the world.
Share DemWorks, both our podcasts and our videos, on social media to amplify the voice of democracy heroes.
The other big change is that, the internet, I mean, this may not continue indefinitely, but at the moment, the internet is now a single space. Politics is now, the authoritarian regimes can play as easily in our political game as we can play in theirs, if not more easily, because we have all kinds of rules and regulations that would prevent us from actually campaigning in Russia. Whereas the Russians have no qualms about running covert campaigns in the United States, as we saw in 2016, or in Poland, where they run it. I mean, they run a very effective anti-Ukrainian sort of covert campaign, or in France and Italy, where they actually support political parties. I mean, with actual funding and money. And I think that was probably not something anybody predicted. Yeah,
they're doing a better job than even political parties are at laying disinformation and rumors and such. To try to create confusion. Yeah,
they produce massive quantities of it, and they understood pretty early on how easy it was going to be, how fast it was going to be to spread misinformation on the internet, I think before others did. Although it's a complicated thing. I mean, so I think they learned a lot from sort of American political PR, and then they transformed it in their way, and they've now brought it back in a particularly virulent and negative form. And to me, that's the biggest threat to democracy. Democracy was always based on the assumption that we could have a rational debate between clearly defined groups or parties or sides, whether it was two parties like in a Anglo-Saxon system or five parties like in a European system, that there was a debate, and it was going to take place, the most important debate would take place in the debating chamber, and that somehow the most, and people would therefore be persuaded by rational argument to choose one side or the other. That's really not quite the case anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it has been, for some time. And, if we have large parts of the population who, accept information that is completely false, which I'm afraid is the case in many countries, it's hard for me to see how we're going to have at least that ideal model of democracy is going to be able to persist.
Right. No, it's something we grapple with here, and we're going to establish a new division on digital technology and the challenge, and figure out what do we need to do to harness this, both to use it for good. I mean, to try to use it in order to more rapidly spread democratic values and educate people in civics and such, as well as mitigate the harm that's done out there.
I mean,
it's, as you say, I think the bad guys are ahead of us, and it's sometimes harder to build something than it is to tear it down or create confusion.
I also think that if I was going to say there was one thing that was neglected since 1989, is civic education.
Yeah.
And this, again, I think this is as true in the United States and
Absolutely.
Britain, as it is anywhere else.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the SAT. This is the test that, every American child who wants to go to college has to take, and you have these very anodyne SAT questions. I mean, maybe there should be an SAT section on the U.S. Constitution. Why don't we have that? And that would force everybody to study for it. But the fact that we don't even consider that, it's not even really part of the curriculum, is really quite odd.
Right.
How do you expect people to be upset when politicians defy the Constitution if most people don't even know it? I mean, this was one of the surprises in Poland, is that it turned out that a percentage of the Polish population was very understood, was committed to, cared a lot about the concept of judicial independence, and quite a lot of people were mystified by it. I mean, they never thought about it. Nobody taught them about it in school. They don't have the kind of cult of the Supreme Court like we have in the United States. They don't have the sort of tradition, and it hadn't occurred to them that it mattered, and they really hadn't been taught it.
Yeah. There's a complacency, I think, that set in.
There was a complacency, that if you have an election, you have a democracy. But of course, democracy is a very delicate, complex system, and people need to be taught to think about it all the time. And you have to be, and a lot of people are not kind of. It is very unnatural for them to accept the idea that they should lose gracefully. It's not doesn't come naturally to people.
Yeah.
And teaching that as part of an educational system is something that, I mean, I know for a fact it wasn't done in Poland, but I also know that it's not done in Britain. I mean, it's not as big a part of the British curriculum as it should be either.
I think even in the United States, there's a complacency about citizenship. We talk about ourselves as citizenship is the most important job that we have, and yet we don't get trained for that job. How bullish are you about Eastern Europe? The thing we have to all understand, I think we talked about it, is expectations need to be managed. Things will go forward and back, and there are a lot of cultural and mindset changes that need to occur in order to allow for the kind of democratic way to be accepted. Are you, you are very realistic about these situations. How do you feel now?
I don't think Eastern Europe should be treated as a separate category from the rest of Europe.
Yes, let me say Europe.
Or indeed from the West. It so happens that a couple of anti-pluralist or anti-democratic ruling parties have won there. But you can see that problem in other parts of the world. So I'm not especially negative about Eastern Europe. My fear is about all of us.
Yeah, I completely agree. We're all in this together in a way.
Yes.
And we can be inspired by the leader of Slovakia and what
Exactly.
she did there. I mean, this is the great thing. What we have done, we've sort of planted seeds, and people are building on it, for better or for worse. And now we're getting, I think, inspired in return by people marching in Hong Kong or in streets of Moscow or pushing back in other places.
So that's the other side of the story, is that there is this huge, when you don't have democracy, so democracy's terrible, and it doesn't work, and we can't agree, and it's sloppy and it's inefficient, and then when you don't have it, then you realize you get governments that are even more corrupt and even more inefficient and and even more brutal. And the result is that we see in Hong Kong this extraordinary new wave of protests, very sophisticated, making use of all kinds of new technology, avoiding the use of a leader just so that they can move in unexpected ways to fool the police. And you see in Moscow, where democracy has been dead for 2 decades, where you see a generation of people, recent marches in Moscow and protests in Moscow have been about local elections. Right. We want fair local elections. Yep. It's not even about the presidency. It's about we would like a Moscow city council that has real people on it and not people who've been effectively appointed. And so almost everywhere, where you don't have democracy, you have an equal amount of unhappiness. So, it's a strange moment where the democracies are in trouble, but the autocracies are in trouble too.
Yeah, people want a voice. I don't think it's ever dead anywhere because people have a natural desire to have a say in their affairs.
Yeah, they want a voice, and people want some sense of justice, that somehow the state they live in is just, and there's some element of fairness in the system. And that just reemerges, however much you suppress it. It reemerges almost everywhere.
Let me ask you one last thing, as we're, I think, over time. So I want to ask you to say something about From a Polish Country House Kitchen, which was your book or a cookbook about Polish cooking. Where did that idea come from? And
so it was a fun project. A friend of mine, Danielle Crittenden, came to visit me in Poland, and we went to restaurants, and I made dinner for her, and at some point she stood in my kitchen and she said, she'd been in Poland previously in 1990, I think, and this was 2005 or something, and she said, there's been a revolution here. Somebody should record it, because there had been this total transformation in Polish cooking. I mean, and that was true.
Is that right?
From the communist era to the era, and then there was sort of the communist era, then there was the sort of new capitalist moment when you had a lot of stuffy French restaurants in Warsaw. And then there was this new era when you began to have new Polish restaurants with using new kinds of ingredients and traditional food and so on. So we thought we would write a cookbook that showed that. In other words, this sort of new Polish cooking, lighter, healthier, more interesting, but still recognizable.
What's the best?
So my favorite Polish recipes are soups. There's one called żurek, for example, which is based on a base. It's made out of kind of sour bread. It has a kind of sour broth that and it tastes like nothing else, and it's a very specific Polish taste.
I'm hungry. All right, we will for another time we will taste the soups. But Anne, thank you so much.
Thanks for having
joining
me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us. Share DemWorks, both our podcasts and our videos, on social media to amplify the voice of democracy heroes. I'm Derek Mitchell, and this has been DemWorks. Thank you for listening.